Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to British History. Today we're going to be jumping into a fun topic. We're going to be looking at British cultural exports and what those are, and you look at some examples there. And we'll also spend some time looking at what does it mean to be British, especially in modern day terms. That things have changed quite a bit, and so we'll be jumping into that. So you can enjoy the process here. It's a little bit different within the recorded video version, just because you can't discuss some of the things that you might be familiar with. But take do the mental exercise with me, if you don't mind, to think through what your perceptions of British culture are, and your perceptions of what it means to be British are, as we kind of go through this. I think you'll find that beneficial. So let's jump in. So, right off the bat, what is a cultural export? A rather dull slide here, apologies, but we'll add to it a bit. What is a cultural export? So think on that for just a second, and we'll dive in on what it is and examples from your own country and Britain and others. Think about what other countries, their cultural exports are. So an export, in general, could be cotton or grain or lithium for batteries. Who knows what various countries have. Today, the United States is a net exporter of natural gas, of all things. But exports ultimately are something valuable that you have enough of and you can sell to other countries. And so for a cultural export, it's something that is unique and valuable enough that other countries would want it. And so it's something that your country is sending out into the world. And it's hard to argue which countries have the most significant cultural exports in the world, but as far as importance for the number of people, Britain does pretty well for itself. It has a high rate of strong cultural exports, and has for quite a while. So it's something that's valuable, and it's something that's unique to that culture. So when we look at it, we go, that's British. That's something of quality that came from the UK that we appreciate. And as far as cultural exports go, it's not something like grain or some other commodity that you can just put in a shipping container, but it's something that's often sort of intangible. It's more. It may be an actual thing, but it's impactful beyond just that thing. And so these are some examples. So food, style. If you look to maybe France, those are a couple that their culture has just exported in more than almost anybody else. Philosophy. Certain Asian countries, their philosophy is impactful. German philosophers, going back many centuries ago, Greek philosophers. Art, many countries are particularly well known for their art literature, depending on the language that people export in, and movies. That's one that the United States is particularly strong in, and among other things. But think about it. What a lot of people here have Mexican heritage. What cultural exports does Mexico provide? You can think of any number. One thing that I've noted in previous years is that the movie Coco, if you saw that, was particularly strong in showing some of, not all, but doing a fairly solid representation of some aspects of Mexican culture, and did a fairly good job at that. So there's different ways that it happens, but it's something to at least to think about. It's hard to put an actual label on the exact thing, but it's fun to imagine. So do that for yourself. Think to your heritage. What cultural exports have the previous countries in your heritage sent out? That can be a fun exercise. And so for the British, they are obviously more than just Shakespeare. That's what, for a very long time, that was one of the major things that got discussed in schools. What you always had to go back to Shakespeare. And I don't know today if high schools do that quite as much, but it's a major influence on society. And so we can't completely ignore it, because as far as culture goes, this was one of the UK's first major cultural exports. The importance of the works of Shakespeare, it is hard to underestimate. Very, very critical. So there's a few points of language that are worth noting. So have you ever heard any of these phrases here? All that glitters is not gold. The be-all and end-all. All's well that ends well. A brave new world. Break the ice, dead as a doornail. Heart of gold. A wild goose chase. So before Shakespeare, and each of those comes from a different play written by Shakespeare. Wild Goose Chase from Romeo and Juliet. The Dead as a Doornail from Henry VI. Make sure I get that right. And many, many others. Merchant of Venice, Macbeth, Tempest, Taming of the Shrew. So he has had an outsized impact on English language. And before him, we didn't have these phrases that we could just throw about. And so that has been a major point of importance. If you're not familiar with Shakespeare and the significance there, this is a quick video, and I'll link a few videos below each of these videos. This one is Benedict Cumberbatch as Hamlet. So a little bit more of a recent person with a connection here to Shakespeare. So it's not just of Elizabethan importance, really. This was the era in which Shakespeare was living and writing, and Elizabeth died in 1603, and so he's considered Elizabethan. And so what he was commenting on and writing about was of Elizabeth, or of Elizabeth's period, or before that, pulling from history right there. But a lot of the commentary and was focused on that society. Even the language was focused on that society. But still, the themes themselves are what still stick with us, and that's why movie after movie after movie, say every 10 years, 15 years, you'll get another crop of Shakespeare movies that get remade. Romeo and Juliet has been remade and modernized 1,000 times, it feels like, because those themes still resonate, because the themes of power and love and greed and money and family and struggle, all those connect with us, and they're very human issues. And Shakespeare had a certain way of revealing those themes to us that still stick with us today. And so that is a significant cultural export. So this is another video here on the continuing cultural relevance of Shakespeare. So it's worth your time to check that out as well. Another area that post-Shakespeare, getting into the 1700s and then definitely the 1800s, you got a number of British authors that were significant to culture, if I can get the word out, in general. This is a example here of some of the female writers of the Victorian era. Jane Austen, who had, gripping stories of the middle class, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. Again, these are stories that still speak to us today and get remade and remade for each successive generation, obviously to make them look right for the generation visually, and but also the themes, do still connect. And her contribution really was the the modern character in novels, ordinary people in everyday life. She was writing in the very late 1700s, was published in the very early 1800s, published anonymously, very much a realist, and had women at the center of the story. So all these things are somewhat revolutionary for how things could be written and what stories are valuable to us. And so sometimes it's not even the story itself, but the way that the story is written, or the goals of the story, writing the story in itself, are valuable to us. Charlotte Bronte explored inner life as an aspect of fiction. So here, Jane Eyre, you may not have read it, but you probably know the title. And so looking at, a person's sort of inner monologue and how they are, often stories in them will have a character arc. And for this, it's having a character arc within a person. How do they change inside over time? So that is valuable to us as well. We see that, a lot of that even in TV today. A lot of these kinds of themes get translated there as well. So she was writing in the 1840s. And then we've mentioned Mary Shelley previously in the semester, writing about Frankenstein, but adding to the growing world of science fiction and what is possible kind of idea. That was also significant, asking moral questions of ourselves through fiction is a unique and also very valuable way to address questions even before they happen. So currently, you can think of the modern version of this. So at this time, the idea was, okay, well, what would happen if we were able to give life to a created being, or what all the more questions surrounding that now are more the science fiction questions that would resonate with us are how are we going to cope with artificial intelligence once it reaches a certain threshold? Do we lock that down and not allow it to happen? Do we treat it as a individual with rights? That's the sorts of things that science fiction today is currently dealing with. And so that's the tradition that begins here. And a lot of these do get turned into movies, as I mentioned before. So you see some of the ones here with Keira Knightley and others, and even going back to the very beginning of the movie making. And we'll come back here in just a second so we don't run out of time and talk about Charles Dickens.